your statement was, this talk outlines a natural philosophical pathway beyond the sense-bound intellect through the cultivation of a new organ of cognitive perception, the etheric imagination. And just from your other statements, what draws me to Steiner is that he is acutely aware of the problem with model centrism in contemporary scientific materialism, and so on. I won't take any more time. Go ahead, Matt.
Thank you, Walter. Should be sharing my screen now. Can you all see that?
Yes. We can see it.
Great. So you see the slide behind me? Awesome. Okay. So really lovely to be here this morning, quite early for me. I've been enjoying very much the last 3 days of the Mysteries of Technology conference, and I'm very grateful to have been invited. I think it's important what MysTech is doing, not only for the wider world, to see the ways in which bringing spirituality to our everyday lives and to our scientific research is so essential, but also for anthroposophists who might take maybe an overly luciferic attitude towards technology. We really do need to engage with those developments, because otherwise a lot will be lost to the materialistic attitudes, which are having another moment right now. I would say there's a large cadre of so-called transhumanists that are pushing into this new technological age, full steam ahead with very Ahrimanic attitudes. And I think the work that we're all doing this weekend is an important source of resistance to that, but really it's a loving resistance, because some of that technological advance is of course inevitable and important for our evolution. So my presentation is titled Etheric Imagination as Participatory Knowing, and I'll be doing or attempting a process philosophical reading of Rudolf Steiner's Light course. Process philosophy is kind of my specialty as a academic philosopher. Most of my research is engaging in process metaphysics and applying process philosophy to the natural sciences, to the study of consciousness, and to the social sciences. Alfred North Whitehead is the major 20th century contributor to process philosophy, but other thinkers like Henri Bergson and Pierre Teilhard de Chardin are often also thought of as process philosophers. And I see thinkers like Goethe and Schelling, the German idealist, as well as Steiner, as part of this tradition, as we'll see. So what you're looking at here are two paintings by J.M.W. Turner. The one on the left is called Shade and Darkness, the Evening of the Deluge. The one on the right is called Light and Color, Goethe's Theory, the Morning After the Deluge, Moses Writing the Book of Genesis. And these were both exhibited in 1843 in London, I believe. And it's a bit of a tip of the hat to Goethe by Turner. You can sort of see the Goethean color wheel on the right. And the idea is that the meeting of light and dark generate this display. And Turner wrote underneath the second painting on the right, the returning sun exhaled the earth's humid bubbles and reflected her lot forms, each in a prismatic guise. So I'm thinking with these three fellows, I've already written and published a bit about Goethe and Whitehead and their shared scientific methodology. So they approach science in a very similar way. Goethe says, science helps us before all things in this, that it somewhat lightens the feeling of wonder with which nature fills us. Whitehead says, philosophy begins in wonder, and at the end, when philosophic thought has done its best, the wonder remains. There have been added, however, some grasp of the immensity of things, some purification of emotion by understanding. Elsewhere, Whitehead will use the term elucidate to describe the task of philosophy in relationship to experience. The point is not to explain away experience by reference to some hidden mechanism behind experience, but really to stay with experience and to shed light upon it. So I think very much like Goethe in his phenomenological approach. I'll share more about this convergence in their methodologies in a second here. But first, let's talk about the light course. So Steiner delivers the light course, so-called, named after by editors, in Stuttgart. And it was for Waldorf teachers, really the first group of Waldorf teachers, late 1919, early 1920, 10 days in a row. He delivered these lectures, and this, I believe, is a photograph of this first Waldorf school. And Steiner was asked to provide some direction to the Waldorf teachers as to how to teach physics to their students. And so what Steiner was really trying to do is sow some Goethean seeds into the next generation of researchers, these young children who might grow up to become scientists, so that, they could be given an educational environment wherein they would be encouraged to remain in a participatory relationship with their embodied sensory experience of warmth and light and sound, and not be educated in such a way that their intellect is all that is addressed, and they're rushed to a kind of mechanistic or mathematical explanation without ever having directly encountered the phenomena that are supposedly being explained. And so there's a pedagogical purpose behind Steiner giving these lectures on physics. And Steiner also points out that when he began researching Goethe's scientific method and the results of his scientific research in the 1880s, as he was editing Goethe's scientific works, that physics at that point was still locked into the mechanistic world picture. And there wasn't much hope at that point, Steiner felt, for something like a Goethean physics. There was just no way to connect with physicists. But 30 years later, in 1920, the beginning of 1920, as he's finishing up these lectures, the situation had changed dramatically. As Steiner put it, physics had found itself caught up in transformation, so much so that he says there is much we could interpret as the dawn of a new worldview. So some of the things that Steiner attempts in this light course, which is a kind of Goethean physics, he wants to shift us away from understanding natural science as the search for hidden physical causes to an understanding of science as the natural science as the study of the metamorphosis of phenomena. He wants to help us imagine the etheric and astral layers of the cosmos through spiritual perception of light, pressure, heat, sound, and other phenomena. He wants to help us grasp the fact that space and time are abstractions from concrete experience of nature, right? Rather than thinking of space and time as Newton did, or even as Einstein still does, as kind of these containers that we as massive bodies exist within. We want to grasp space and time as ways that we divide up our concrete experience and can then geometrically or arithmetically think about them and model abstractly what's going on in nature. Very useful exercises, but there's a gap that that I'll explore between our mathematical abstractions and the physical world itself. He wants to show us how the human organism is a microcosm, and then he'll also engage in this esoteric physiology of the eyes, the ears, the larynx, and so forth, to show us that our sensory organs and our qualitative sensory experience are not providing mere secondary characteristics, but are really showing us the qualitative essence of nature. And so we need to bring our sensory experience, our qualitative experience, back into our picture of the physical world if we hope to know it truly. All right. So I'm going to share a bit more about Whitehead's approach here to the study of nature. Nature for Whitehead becomes the study of what we are aware of in perception. Natural science, rather, becomes the study of what we are aware of in perception. And so here's how he lays out our situation. He says philosophy has to rescue the facts as they are from the facts as they appear. We view the sky at noon on a fine day. It is blue, flooded by the light of the sun. The direct observation is the sun as the sole origin of light and the bare heavens. Conceive the myth of Adam and Eve in the garden on the first day of human life. They watch the sunset. The stars appear, and lo, creation widened to man's view. The excess of light discloses facts and also conceals them. Right? So this illustrates, I think, the way in which, for both Goethe and Whitehead, as we are studying the metamorphosis of phenomena in nature, we have to make sure that we get the full sort of cycle, the full sequence of metamorphosis, right? If we didn't wait until the sun set in our initial attempt to understand the universe scientifically, we would be missing a large part of this, of the phenomena of the heavens, right? Even though the day is flooded with light, that light not only reveals things to us, but it also conceals the fact, namely the fact of the night sky. So for both Goethe and Whitehead, there's an insistence that we stay with the phenomena in their full round of archetypal metamorphosis or morphogenesis, you could say. And that we stay with the evolving relationship between the perceiver and the perceived, right? Not rushing to conjure something behind phenomena, something that would be unperceived, but also unperceivable, even in principle, often in modern physics, that would supposedly explain the phenomena. And so theory, in Goethe's sense, and Ashton touched on this yesterday, it should be understood in the original Greek sense of theoria, the original Platonic sense, as a kind of contemplative and participatory observation where we're not just standing back and watching, but we're just as much an actor on the stage as we are part of the audience. Theory does have the same root as theater, but I think the point here is that when we're trying to understand the meaning of the drama unfolding on the stage, if we were to pull back the curtain and look at what's going on in the dressing rooms, I think we would be somewhat dissatisfied if our goal was to understand the drama of perceptible nature, the display on the stage and the meaning of the action. If we pull back the curtain, we're going to find, a bunch of, props and actors and stuff half made up and whatnot, but we're not actually going to be satisfied with that if, again, what we're trying to explain is our participatory engagement, our actual perception of nature. Now, of course, there's more to phenomena than what at first meets the eye, just as this story from Whitehead about moving from day to night on the first day of creation suggests. There's more than what first meets the eye, right? So we don't want to go behind or beyond phenomena, but we may need to look deeper within the phenomena, staying with their metamorphic processes until we're sure that the whole has revealed itself. Because as Whitehead reminds us, in our experience, there's always the dim background from which we derive and to which we return. We are not enjoying a limited doll's house of clear and distinct things, secluded from all ambiguity. In the darkness beyond, there ever looms the vague mass, which is the universe begetting us. And so, we can think of this in terms of the creative power within us at our core, and also the creativity that encompasses us, a kind of peripheral power of unbound potential. And there's some connection between this creative power within us and this creativity encompassing us, right? Which has something to do with the relationship between spirit and nature. We can only understand nature aright when we consider that there is to our physical senses at least, an invisible creativity, as it were, that we can come into relationship with through the further development of the scientific method beyond just natural science into spiritual science. So we'll get there in a second here. So one of the things that Whitehead brought to his philosophy of nature and his understanding of cosmology was to collapse this modern distinction that goes back to people like David Hume between facts and values, because we were left with a picture of nature as lacking all value. Whitehead says that when you understand all about the sun and all about the atmosphere and all about the rotation of the earth, you may still miss the radiance of the sunset. There is no substitute for the direct perception of the concrete achievement of a thing in its actuality, or of a process in its actuality. We want concrete fact with a high light thrown on what is relevant to its preciousness, right? And so when we study the phenomena of nature, we're driven by this sense of love for the preciousness of the phenomenon. And that reveals the value of the phenomenon to us in a way that a merely neutral, unloving observation would not. We might be able to depict the facts, so-called, but for Whitehead, the facts really are a means of conveying values. Every fact is a value achievement, he would say, right? And so we have to study nature with a sense of its value or its preciousness. Last quote from Whitehead here, which I think shows, again, his alignment with the Goethean method of phenomenological science. Whitehead says, according to the view which I am putting before you, there is nothing behind the veil of the procession of becomingness, although there is much pictured on that veil and essential to it, which our dim consciousness does not readily decipher. Indeed, the metaphor of a veil of appearance is wholly wrong. Reality is nothing else than the process of becomingness, of which we are dimly conscious. Every detail of the process is open for consciousness, though in fact our individual consciousness is only aware of a very small fragment of what is there for knowledge. So Whitehead's challenging this idea that the perceived world, the world of our perceptual experience, is a kind of veil, because that does imply there's something hidden behind it that is causing it. And he thinks it's better to think of this appearance, this world of appearance, as a process of becomingness, where at any given time in our own development as scientific researchers, we're only aware of part of what's actually displayed. As we cultivate our own consciousness, develop our attention, and in Steiner's sense, as we begin to cultivate higher organs of perception, we can see more on this veil, if you want, than at first met our eyes, right? And so for Whitehead, like for Steiner and like for Goethe, there's nothing that we can't know, and know in a concrete, experiential way, right? It's just that sometimes the phenomena show themselves only partially, and we have to make sure we're getting the whole picture before we claim to know the whole of the phenomenon. So this veil of becomingness, as Whitehead refers to it, is akin to Goethe's study of the metamorphosis of phenomena, right? They're both, and Steiner with them, influenced by Goethe, if not by Whitehead, they're all searching for the systematic relations among various perceptions, right? Because rightly arranged, the facts themselves flower into theory. So the archetypal phenomena blossom not behind or beneath what we see, but between seer and seen, right? And so there's a relational dimension to this, and that's also part of the participatory aspect of this approach to science. The phenomena, the archetypal phenomena, are between seer and seen, not just on one side, subject or object, but between. So part of what's required in this shift to a more participatory form of science, we can turn to Schelling, Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph von Schelling, German idealist, who was influenced by Goethe and influenced Goethe in turn, much younger than Goethe. Goethe was sort of a father figure for Schelling and brought Schelling more into touch, brought him down from the heights of idealism into touch with the experimental results that he was finding in his study of color and plant growth. Schelling recognizes that when we talk about forces of nature, we only understand what we mean by a force by reference to our own feeling. Right? So he says, I quote him from his Ideas for Philosophy of Nature, you can in no way make intelligible what a force might be independent of you. For force as such makes itself known only to your feeling. He says, we are not born to waste our mental power in conflict against a fantasy world, but to exert, in other words, a world of mere models, but to exert all of our powers upon a world which has influence upon us, lets us feel its forces, and upon which we can react. Between us and the world, therefore, no rift must be established. Right? And so this is Schelling laying out his own approach to the philosophy of nature, which I think is akin to Goethe's, to Whitehead's, and to Steiner's. Now, the point here is not that we want to be anti-mathematical and reject the idea of mathematical reflection upon what we observe. And there's a misunderstanding, I think, of Goethe as somehow anti-mathematical, which is not the case at all. He himself analogizes his scientific method of staying with the whole sequence of phenomena to the way that a geometer will demonstrate a theorem, right? You want to stay you don't want any gaps in your demonstration, just as Goethe doesn't want any gaps in the sequence of phenomena. So anyone who's curious to see how Goethe is actually more mathematical than you might imagine at first, I can share this article with you that I've written in Dialogue, the Journal of for Holistic Science. This is Whitehead's famous book, Process and Reality. So, moving right along. So, Whitehead and Goethe were both interested in natural science and said some things about spirituality that we could find interesting, but I don't know that either of them really considered the possibility of a spiritual science, as Steiner put forward, anthroposophy. So we can study sight itself. We can study sensibility as such, right? Meaning we can turn our scientific attention onto our own consciousness as percipients of nature. But this does mean leaving the limits of natural science behind, to some degree, to begin a complementary but a fundamentally new kind of inquiry. Steiner calls this, of course, spiritual science. And it's important to remember, though, that spiritual science does not go beyond phenomena, but rather recognizes the role of our own conscious, imaginative, inspired, and intuitive thinking activity in disclosing a new kind of phenomena, right? And as conscious, thinking, feeling, and willing human beings, we can disclose new phenomena both via memory, recollecting ancient epochs, and also via creativity, via our own artistic expression. Now, part of our own creativity as individual thinking beings is that, we can engage in arithmetic, geometry, and kinematics, and we can develop these mathematical models of nature. But Steiner points out that there is what he calls a mighty gap that needs to be leapt in order to close the chasm that exists between mathematics and the physical forces that we actually measure. So Whitehead similarly points out that while in our mathematical models we may refer to such entities as point instants, that in nature, in concrete nature, there is no such thing. There is no nature at an instant, right? And so when Whitehead talks about the atomic elements, for example, and he was writing in the mid-1920s, just as quantum theory was coming into its own, he analogizes each atomic element to a kind of musical note, right? And just like A musical note, an element, requires its whole period to manifest. It's a vibratory, streaming energy event. It's not a little BB or billiard ball, right? It is, in fact, akin to a musical note, and just like musical notes have a kind of, convey a sort of value, they're an aesthetic achievement of sorts. Whitehead would say the same about the atomic elements. They are the achievements of value, of energy seeking to organize itself so as to express a value. So when we study these physical phenomena, though, Steiner wants us to shift from only considering the central forces of physics, as he refers to them, to also consider the peripheral etheric forces, right? And really this becomes essential to understand the formation of living organisms. You can get along for a certain amount of time ignoring these peripheral forces in the study of non-biological, physics, inorganic physics and chemistry, but you can only get so far even there. Because these etheric peripheral forces are essential for understanding self-organization in nature at any scale, right? Even at the physical scale. And so we have to develop the task of a spiritual science meeting natural science is that we must develop a relationship to the incalculable infinity of the macrocosm. That is, to the way that the whole cosmos is active in shaping every part of itself, especially among organisms and especially the human being, which for Goethe, for Steiner especially, becomes a microcosm, right? A kind of mirror for the cosmos as a whole, such that by studying ourselves, we can learn about the whole. So in an attempt to get closer to our concrete experience of the phenomena of nature, Steiner asks in his light course, he asks, what is mass for our experience? And the answer he gives is, well, it's really pressure, right? We feel gravity, we feel our own mass as pressure. I feel pressure on my butt right now on the chair, right? I feel pressure with the top half of my body sitting upright on my neck and so on. And so this is how we directly experience gravity and our own mass, right? And Steiner thinks that there's a qualitative ratio that links the quality of our own wakefulness to the intensity of the pressure that we're exerting or that we're perceiving in our immediate environment, right? So there's a link between our wakefulness and this feeling of pressure. So as mass or external pressure increases, he says that consciousness is canceled out. We go to sleep. And he connects this to the fact that in our willing, where he says we're also sleeping, we're united with this cosmic force of gravity, right? We're only awake to ourselves in our thinking. And he says, physiologically, we're awake to ourselves in our thinking because of the buoyancy of the brain, that the brain is literally floating in cerebrospinal fluid. And so this is part of, Steiner introducing his esoteric physiology to explain the way in which working within and through and around the physical body, visible to our physical eyes, is the etheric body and the astral body. And he wants to describe in detail how the etheric and astral bodies relate to the physical anatomy of the eye, because he points out that unlike with the rest of the body, where the etheric body is woven more tightly into the physical organs, in the eyes, the etheric body becomes relatively independent. And because of this relative independence of the etheric body, the astral body is in turn able to more intimately weave itself into the etheric eye. And Steiner describes the eye growing progressively more vital, more living, as you move from the sclera and the cornea to the vitreous body and the retina, more towards the inside and the back of the eye. And he tries to dispel the materialistic idea that the nerves of the retina, rather than, say, the astral body, might somehow be responsible for our sensations of light. Because, a physiologist can track the supposed, in Steiner's time, vibrations of the ether and the luminiferous ether into the eye, through the lens, into the retina, and into the optic nerve, back into the occipital lobe in the brain. You can trace sort of the flow of energy here, but at no point does anything like the sensation of light appear. Right? You're not going to be able to explain that physically. You're going to need, Steiner would say, to make reference to these other layers of reality, the etheric, the astral. And he says, if it were true that there were some physiological explanation for our sensations of light and color, you would think that we would feel the visual world most strongly where the contact first occurred, namely on the retina, the surface of the back of the eye, rather than where it is projected out into the colored surfaces of the world all around us, right? And so we don't see light where it makes contact with our body. We don't see light at all. We see color projected out into the world, right? And so that suggests there's more going on than just the visible physical body when we're sensing color phenomena. Now, of course, materialistic physicists imagined light by analogy to sound waves, and Steiner thinks this is a mistake. This analogy between light and sound waves is very useful, and it's where this old idea, this 19th century idea of a luminiferous ether was invented, that there's this very subtle medium through which light is vibrating. And Einstein is usually credited with having eliminated this luminiferous ether, but we're still left with the mystery of what medium waves of light might be propagating through. And Einstein himself said that his gravitational field, his space-time manifold, was in fact just a new ether in his terms. And so it's not so much that he eliminated the ether as he introduced a new kind. And I think there's bringing space and time together is a very valuable insight, but Einstein does so in an overly abstract way. He actually ends up identifying the physics of gravitation with this abstract mathematical model of space and time. And that creates a kind of monster. And Whitehead was very critical of Einstein for this reason. He accepted relativity in the sense that we can't understand space without time. He accepts the conversion of energy and matter. He accepts a lot of Einstein's science, but he rejects this metaphysical move, really, of identifying the physics of gravitation with a space-time manifold, a mathematical, geometrical picture of four-dimensional space-time, for many reasons, because it does violence to our concrete experience, but also, I'll just briefly mention this. We can go into it later if anyone's interested. Whitehead thinks that there's a basic epistemological contradiction in Einstein's view, because Einstein's basically saying that space-time is warped by mass, and so gravity is no longer a force, right? Gravity is this warping of space-time itself, and massive objects fall into those warps. The problem with that view is, in order to measure deep space, we need straight rulers or their equivalents, and the issue would be, in Einstein's view of this, we would first need to know where all the mass is in order to make accurate measurements of deep space. But the problem is we can't know where all the mass is until we make measurements. And so if there are just intervening masses that we don't see yet causing space-time itself to warp, we can never be sure if our ruler is straight or rigid. And Whitehead says there's a problem here. Whitehead actually develops his own tensor equations, his own theory of relativity that's empirically equivalent to Einstein's. It makes all the same predictions and would expect the same measurements of the perihelion of Mercury and all these things. But it doesn't require curved space, right? It's imagining gravity, again, as a force, more akin to electromagnetism. Anyways, that's an aside. Steiner wants us to consider, and let me quote Steiner here. He says, "Consider the difference between the pure perception of the phenomena, that is, remaining within the phenomena and investigating and describing them, and simply making something up about the phenomena. The movement of the ether is, after all, a pure invention. Of course, we can make calculations about something like this, which we have made up, but the fact that we can make calculations about it is no proof that the thing is there. The purely kinematic is something purely imaginary, and calculations are also imaginary. So let's see what Steiner means when he says this. Steiner elaborates a train of thought whereby space and time are understood to be abstractions from velocity. And the formula for velocity, he tells us, is usually written v equals d over t. Velocity equals distance divided by time. The materialistic mode of thought habitually interprets this formula as though there was something real in external nature corresponding to a distance in space that has been traveled and a time during which this traversal has occurred. We are then led to imagine the velocity itself is the abstraction, something that's arrived at through calculation of the real quantities of distance and time. But Steiner argues that the reverse is in fact the case. Quote, "That is not how it is in nature. Of these three quantities, velocity, space, and time, velocity is actually the only real one. Velocity is the one that is outside us. We arrive at the others, distance and time, only by dividing, by splitting, so to speak, the unified velocity into two abstract things, which we create on the basis of the existing velocity." All right, and so Whitehead makes a similar point when he refers to he says the extension of space is the ghost of transition. The extension of space is the ghost of transition. On Steiner's reading, space and time are only there because of velocity. We create the division between space and time with our own thought processes. Space and time are not, for this reason, something we can easily dispense with, of course. They're integral to our perception in a way that external velocity is not, according to Steiner, because it is by means of what Steiner refers to as our innate instruments of space and time that we measure velocity. In other words, we're not measuring space and time as external realities. We're measuring external realities by means of our ideal constructs of space and time. So I mentioned Whitehead's intervention into Einstein's conception of the physics of relativity, and he's following a similar train of thought to Steiner here. As he put it in his book, A Concept of Nature, Whitehead writes, "When you think of space alone, or of time alone, you are dealing in abstractions. Namely, you are leaving out an essential element in the life of nature as known to you in the experience of your senses. Space and time are abstractions. What I mean is that there are no spatial facts or temporal facts apart from physical nature, namely that space and time are merely ways of expressing certain truths about the relations between events." And so for Whitehead, nature is not made of point instants, it's not made of atoms or empty space or linear time. It's made of relations among events, or what he calls actual occasions of experience. And a further convergence between Whitehead and Steiner here is that after the discovery of non-Euclidean geometries, which followed from the exploration of alternative parallel postulates, it became clear that there are many ways of conceptualizing space, and that the way we choose to conceptualize space, the geometry that we choose, is really a matter of convention. Depends on what we're interested in learning. Now, to say that the geometry we choose to measure space is a matter, or space-time is a matter of convention, doesn't mean that 30 miles walk is not a long walk for everyone. That's not what conventionality means in this case. What it means is that geometries can be developed without any reference to measurement, and thus without any reference to distance or numerical coordinates indicating points. Right? You can have a point-free geometry, and so Whitehead, like Steiner, was interested in the development of and the application of so-called non-metrical projective geometries. And there's a way in which, through projective geometry, you can translate between any of these other metrical forms of geometry that we might use to study the external world. So Steiner realizes that his claims may sound superficially similar to Kant, to Immanuel Kant's idealistic account of space and time in his Critique of Pure Reason in a section called The Transcendental Aesthetic, where Kant describes space as our form of outer intuition, rather, and time as our form of inner intuition, and Kant connects geometry with spatial intuition and arithmetic with our intuition of time. Steiner's point is different, though. It's not that space and time are in us, as though they were mere subjective constructs. Steiner is saying that we are one with space and time in a way that we are not one with velocity, which he says roars right past us. So the spatio-temporal quality of our thinking links us with other physical bodies. And Steiner says we float, as it were, in space and time, just as other bodies float in it with their various velocities. And in a similar way, we float in light as a common space-filling element, but not with our physical bodies. We float in light with our etheric bodies. Steiner says we float in light with our etheric body. How are we related to the colors that flit about as a result of shining light through a prism, say? The only possibility is that whenever you see colors, you are joined to the colors with your astrality, with your astral body. Although light remains invisible, we are floating in it. In the light you see colors, colors of the spectrum. There you have astral relations of a direct nature. Nothing comes between you and these colors. You see the colors of the body, something comes between them and your astral body, and yet you enter into astral relations with the colors of the body. And so, from this point of view, when we try to understand what is color, we don't want to take the physicist's point of view and say, oh, color is the wavelength of light. We don't want to take just a merely subjective point of view and say, oh, color is made up in our subjectivity. Color is a relationship, an astral relationship in Steiner's sense, but it's a relationship between our own seeing, the light, and the dark, or the material world, the bodies. It's a relationship between these, and not simply located just in our eye, say, or just in the body, or just in light, the wavelength of light. So Steiner then discusses our perception of the sun and our understanding of gravitation, our perception of the movements of the planets overhead. He says, when confronted with each phenomenon, we have to investigate to what extent it is a reality or only something that has been cut out of a whole. If you look at the sun and the moon, or the sun and the earth on their own, naturally you might as well make up a force of gravity, a kind of gravitation, just as you might invent a kind of gravitation when, say, my forehead attracts my right hand. But when you look at the sun and the earth and the moon, all the other planets, you're looking at things that aren't whole. Rather, they are, Steiner says, the limbs of the entire planetary system. So there's one organism, and just as I move my arm as part of a single organism, the planets move about as the limbs of a single organism. And so Steiner's suggesting that we don't need to invent this force of gravity to explain that coordinated motion if we understand the solar system organically. So we're trying to perceive physical space-time in light of etheric imagination, to see that the sun is not in space, the sun creates space. That would be the idea here. And this kind of follows from Whitehead's reformulation of Einstein's relativity theory, as I had described earlier, to avoid this nonsensical idea of curved space-time. Whitehead has a similar point to Steiner's about velocity also. When he's critiquing Newton's concept of motion, he points out that, Newton leaves out time, basically, and so there can be no meaning given to the idea of velocity in Newton's theory of motion, because his theory refers only to this bit of matter occupying this region at this durationless instant. And to understand velocity, Whitehead says, matters of fact must involve transition in their essence, because all realization involves implication in the creative advance, as he puts it, right? And so transition, velocity, this is what is real. Space and time are abstractions, and matter also an abstraction. It turns out that matter is the most abstract idea ever invented by the human mind. We need to come to our senses in order to see that natural science is not the study of matter and motion. Natural science is the study of living phenomena as they move through their metamorphic patterns of relationship. It's also important to recognize that just as the solar system is a kind of organism, really, for Steiner, for Whitehead, for Goethe, there is no such thing as inorganic matter, or at least to the extent that there is such a thing as dead matter, it does not precede life. To the extent that there is dead matter, it exists as the skeletal remains of life, right? It's the excretion of life. It comes after life, not before it. There's no way to get life out of dead matter. So this is William James. I'm going to need to skip ahead a little bit here to finish in about 6 minutes. Whitehead, so Steiner says the following. He says, we are not outside of things and don't just project phenomena into space. We are thoroughly in things with our being, and are in things all the more as we ascend from certain physical phenomena. We are not in colored phenomena with our ordinary bodily nature, but with our etheric, and therefore with our astral nature, as I said earlier. Steiner then, he returns in the light course to the important difference that exists in our perception of light, warmth, and air. We live into each medium at different levels of our being, right? And this is why it's problematic to analogize light waves to sound waves, because our visual experience of light and our auditory experience of sound are quite different. It is only through our eyes that we dip into light-filled space, whereas our entire organism provides our sense organ for heat. So Steiner says, I am to heat just as the eye is to light, right? So we can make these analogies, but we don't want to take them too far. The whole body floats in heat just as the eye floats in light. So Steiner asks us repeatedly, what is it in us that is floating in each case? In the case of heat, it is our own warmth body, the heat produced by the metabolic processes that attend and support our organic existence. Our very consciousness lives in this heat, Steiner says, and it is by means of it that we are able to distinguish ourselves from and so discern the relative heat signature of our environment. Steiner will later discuss Julius Robert Mayer and the invention of the law of conservation of energy and the study of thermodynamics. And he expresses skepticism of the metaphysical claim, as useful as the laws of thermodynamics may be for inventing steam engines. He rejects the metaphysical claim that a numerical ratio linking mechanical work with heat somehow proves that the latter, heat, is reducible to a mechanical process, to vibrating molecules, say. Steiner rejects that idea. The human being also, we have these other organs, lungs, larynx, and ears, that allow us to partake in the area with the gaseous element of nature. We come to participate in the phenomena of sound or tone with these organs in a way that's, again, quite unique from our perception of light and of heat. I know we're coming up on, I have 47 minutes. Is that right, Walter? I have about 14 more minutes? 13 more minutes?
Yes, that would be good. I'm just checking again the schedule. You're supposed to go to 11:30, which would give us 7 minutes. But if you want to allow some time for questions, it would be better if you could draw your remarks to a close in the next minute or two.
Okay. I'll have to skip a slide here. Skip several slides. I want to get to this part here. So natural science has so far been limiting itself to the evidence of the brain-bound intellect, right? And our task is, if we want to develop a spiritual science, we need to imaginally descend through etheric imagination into the forces of matter and learn to perceive the etheric life animating nature. Because what's the danger if we don't do this? It's not just materialism as a false idea. As Steiner says in this lecture from 1920 later in the year that he delivered the light course, the problem is not just dealing with a reversal of theories, a spiritual to replace the material. The problem with materialism is that when we think materialistically, our thoughts are brain-bound. We become materialized, right? And so there's a real urgency here. And I found this little creature that is a series of wavelengths, sort of, in a fractal pattern. And it reminds me of what matter appears to be when we think of it as something self-existent, and that Steiner suggests in a number of places that natural scientists are kind of fearful of acknowledging what matter really is, spiritually speaking. It's Ahriman, right? These little Ahrimanic demons. And the problem with materialistic science is not only that it materializes us in our own thinking by making us brain-bound, but it relates to matter as a kind of Maya. And I'll finally just close with this, that Steiner says the whole world apart from the human being is an enigma, and the human being is its solution. So if we imagine matter as something self-existent, independent of our perception, we cannot understand our situation whatsoever. But if we put the human being back into the picture, we recognize that in physical science, we're never measuring light. Rather, we're measuring everything else with light, right? In our visual feelings, we do not see light, we see colored surfaces. So to really know light, we must participate in it, which is really just to say we must experience our own thinking activity. And I just want to let people know about an effort that Ashton Arley and I are engaged in, Earth Phenomenon, where we read Steiner's works. We invite people to present on their research. You can check us out online. All right.
Okay.
All done.
Tom, do we have some questions? We have a little bit of time.
Hi there. Question about imagination as the bridge between inner and outer light. What's the relationship, perhaps, of imagination to the astral, inner sight? What form of light powers imagination?
Well, there's physical light and spiritual light. To see the physical light at all, we need to be partaking in the spiritual light to some degree. It's just that I think as human beings, we are naturally endowed with the capacity to perceive physical light, and are, without any effort on our part, usually not conscious of the spiritual light which meets it. And so the physical light comes to us as a kind of gift. We can see this colorful world around us with our physical eyes, but it takes some degree of cultivation to continue this process of development beyond what nature gives us for free, as it were, so that we can develop these higher organs of perception, to become, first of all, aware of our own soul activity, our own astrality as thinking, feeling, willing creatures, to the extent that we can gain some mastery over our little bit of mastery over our will, to become more aware of our feelings and to become really at one with our thinking activity. That is how we, develop imagination, inspiration, intuition as organs of perception that we have to kind of grow ourselves through our own effort, right? They're not just given to us by nature like our eyes and our ears. And that effort is part of the spiritual task that we have. And it's a good thing we have multiple lifetimes to do it. So, yeah, I'm not sure I can say much else about that.
One more question. Yeah. Whitehead was not an anthroposophist, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So he had no sense of the activities of the hierarchies. This was a question by a member of the audience.
So, as far as I know, Whitehead never read Steiner, I can't say for sure whether he definitely knew about theosophy. He had a son die in the First World War. His son Eric was shot down over France in the Royal Air Force, and Whitehead became very interested, if he wasn't already, in mediums who claim to be able to communicate with the dead, and there's some evidence that he reached out to members of the Theosophical Society, and he may, it's possible he was aware of Steiner. Whitehead doesn't himself write about angelic hierarchies and does not himself write about too much about the spiritual world, though I think his metaphysics is compatible with what Steiner describes. It is, Whitehead does allow there to be a kind of soul of the world, a kind of anima mundi, a kind of living presence throughout everything we might consider to be physical. But no, he was not an anthroposophist and does not talk very much about the occults. He was more trying to bring a new approach to natural science and to our understanding of how there need be no conflict between spirit and matter, or that we can understand consciousness as a natural part of the universe and so on. So I think they're compatible, and I have a desire to write more about the ways in which I see Whitehead's cosmology supporting some of Steiner's spiritual scientific insights, but they have different approaches. As much as I was emphasizing the convergence, they do have different approaches at the end of the day.
There's one final on-point question related specifically to that, just popped up. Consciousness. How would you characterize the main obstacle for people like Whitehead bridging the gap in their thinking to spiritual science?
The main obstacle would be, Whitehead would say, for example, whether or not in Steiner's terms, soul spiritual aspect of the human being is immortal. Whitehead would say, well, that's a matter that, my metaphysics leaves open. It's possible, but we're going to have to wait for the empirical confirmation of that. And so similarly with regard to the work of the hierarchies, say, with regard to, I think Whitehead has his own language for talking about what Steiner means by the etheric and the astral. He doesn't use those words, but I think, he has his own way of talking about those layers of reality. But the main obstacle for Whitehead would be we need more people who can empirically, experientially corroborate and validate the things that Steiner is saying, and it seems that capacity, say, for etheric perception that Steiner thought would start to come online for more and more people in the 20th century. Maybe it has, maybe it hasn't. I mean, I'm not sure how many of us can claim to be clairvoyant, but for Whitehead, until more people are clairvoyant, it's going to be difficult to empirically verify spiritual scientific claims.
Okay, Matt, thank you very much. We'll have to leave this for now. Other questions can come up in the forum. But thank you so much. A lot of questions could come up out of this.
Thanks, Walter. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. Our next speaker is Ari Thorsen. I'll just say a little bit of the bio. Ari was trained in acupuncture, homeopathy, and philosophical medicine, and operates a holistic private veterinary practice in Sandefjord, Norway. He's been active in this sector since the beginning. When I spoke ahead of time with Ari in preparation for today, I mentioned to him Andrew Linnell's request that I try to bring some humor in, and so knowing that Ari was